My brief this evening was to give you some insights into water policy, but to do so in a manner which also allows you to understand why economists look at the world the way they do. And for some that'll be a little scary, no doubt. So the intention this evening is to leave you with a simple economist's view of the world and why it is so difficult for us to even understand sometimes some of the things governments do around water. So really the outline this evening is premised around that idea. So I do want to take some time to talk about how economists look at the world and why, having shaped people to be hardwired as economists and then thrusting them into the water politics, why they might be so perplexed. And to do that, I then need to give you some understanding of the background of water allocation in this country and why it's such a mess. I also want to take a little bit of time to talk about current issues, and particularly in the context of things like water buyback, which is controversial, and hopefully give you some insights into the future. Having sort of given you an outline, you'll notice that there's not much scope in 40 minutes to touch all elements of water. And one of the things I do like discussing is urban water, but regrettably in a presentation of 35 odd minutes I couldn't really do justice to that topic. However, if you do have burning questions about urban water, and people in Bendigo usually do, and rightly so, I'm happy to take them at the end. But if you can hold on to questions until the end, that'll be most appreciative. So I'm assuming that you've got a limited amount of time, unless you're very, very lucky. I'm assuming you've got a limited amount of time and you've made a decision this evening to come out and listen to a public lecture. A very courageous decision, I might add. Obviously, there are trade-offs involved in this. You've made a decision that hopefully what you get out tonight is better than what the alternative was, what an economist might call looking at the opportunity costs. So economists consider resources like this all the time. We imagine that people, generally given sufficient information, they're usually pretty good at making decisions. That if we give you enough information, generally you'll go away and you'll decide what the benefits are, what the costs are, what the trade-offs are, and then you'll make a rational choice. Now, in my science, we call that person rational economic man, Homo economicus. So Homo economicus is this wonderful beast who takes and assimilates information, decides what's the benefits, what's the costs, and then usually proceeds, provided there are net benefits involved in that decision. So it's kind of baffling then, if you're trained as an economist, to then hear other disciplines call you the dismal science. Because in actual fact, we're pretty optimistic folk. Economists tend to have a fairly, optimistic view of the world. We believe that generally people will make the right decisions for themselves, given that they have sufficient information about the benefits and costs that attend a particular decision. So with that background, let's now just quickly turn to water. Well, if you're trained as an economist, you know that water's a resource. Resources by definition are scarce. So therefore the trick about all this is not to panic about scarcity, but rather to think about, well, if we have to make choices, let's make the choices that give us the highest bang for the buck. What choices will give us the biggest return? Or if you like, how can we allocate resources to their highest value use? I guess with any resource, you've got a couple of choices. You could have planned choices where some great body out there, some dictator decides who's going to do what or what resources are going to be used where. And alternatively, you could leave it to individuals to make those choices. And rather than talk about water, because water gets a bit contentious, I'd like you to think just for a moment about labour, your labour, because after all it's a resource that could be used, has alternate uses, and think about what it would be like if the state government decided, because it's so clever, if the state government decided that all labour north of the divide should be devoted to agriculture. Now that would be a planned decision, but you need to think about what that actually entails. There's a couple of problems with planned decisions of this nature. If you think about your labour, for example, if the state government in Melbourne was to decide that all labour north of the divide was to be allocated to the production of agricultural outputs, for a starter, many of you people really don't have much expertise or much interest in agriculture, I suspect. Some of you may have a lot of expertise, many of you may have no expertise at all. To do the best with the resources, that state entity, that omniscient being out there would have to decide they would have to know who's got the best abilities to do each particular task and then allocate those tasks accordingly. So that's one problem. So if you have a planned choice, you need information about the capability of resources. You need information about the implicit cost that attends using those resources in alternate uses. Now, of course, in the context of labour, you know what you're good at, you know what you're best at, and usually governments don't interfere with that decision because, coincidentally, you also happen to vote. There's a second element of a problem with a planned decision, of course, and that relates to the other side of things, that is, having sent you all out to the fields to produce agricultural products, which agricultural products are we actually going to produce? Well, you know, that would take a good deal of information about people's preferences for what they eat. There's going to be, no doubt, some people that are vegetarian, and I understand there's all sorts of strange people around now that are called, well, not strange people, I suppose. They're strange from my perspective. There's apparently these freebins or something. These are people that live out of garbage bins or something. I don't really understand this. But in any case, there are people with many unusual preferences and different preferences around food and what they eat. So if you were a great planner, a great central planner, you would need to know about those preferences, and you'd need to know, at least in advance, so that you could go ahead and plan and allocate labour in Bendigo to growing a particular crop in order to have it delivered to both yourselves and to people in Melbourne. So these planning decisions, making decisions about resources in a planning framework, is complex and usually doesn't work, usually quite costly. So what generally tends to happen, and what most economists would advocate, is that because of these information problems, there's an elegant solution, and the elegant solution is the market. Now this is an interesting picture, and the techie people will be interested to know that there's no copyright on this picture. This is a photograph that was taken by a colleague of mine, Terry Hillman, as some of you will know. Terry found it interesting that he took this photo in Prague, and he found it interesting that the signs not only point to the right, but one of them even bends slightly to the right. So I guess there's a political message in the sign as well. I mean, the great elegance of the market is that all of that information about your capabilities as labour, all of that information about what people want to eat is brought together, and simultaneously those production and consumption decisions are aligned. To have a central plan to do that would be very, very complex and unlikely to be adequate to deal with such complex decisions. So the market does a really good job in terms of sourcing that information. And for those students in the audience, you might think about why you're here. In fact, you invariably are responding to market signals. That's why you're here, primarily. Most of you know what skills and expertise you have. You know what you're interested in. And the reason you choose to undertake further study, presumably, is because you know at the end of that you'll be able to command a premium in the labour market. So you're simply responding to those signals. You're allocating your labour in accordance with those signals. You didn't need some giant computer to do that. You've managed to undertake that on your own. Now, all of that basically sounds okay. In other words, allocating resources using markets will solve all those information problems. But of course, we know there are a few other concerns besides allocating resources. We know, for example, that as individuals we worry about those that don't have enough. We do worry about families that don't have sufficient income. So whilst most people would say, well, economists don't seem to comment on that, they always rabbit on about the market, in actual fact, of course, there's a great body of literature within economics to deal with issues of equity and fairness and redistribution. But the conventional answer to people would be, well, if you have a concern about the allocation of resources and the fact that maybe somebody doesn't have enough income, the way to deal with that is not to fiddle with the market per se, but to use the wealth and income that is generated from that market in order to deal with your concerns about equity. Likewise, you might deal with your concerns about public goods, that is, things that it doesn't make sense for people to try and transact in a market. You would deal with that by extracting the rents from the market and converting that into the things that you're trying to achieve. So in sum then, what do economists think, and how are we hardwired to look at the world? Well, for a start, resources are scarce, and markets generally do a pretty good job of allocating those resources to their best use or their highest value use. If you have another concern that relates to change, social welfare, etc., if you have those concerns, the appropriate mechanism for dealing with that is to tax the wealth and income that is generated by markets and then deal with it with that income. And the final point, which I'll just add, for those of you who are great fans of Bruce McAvaney, there are no special resources. There is no such thing as a special resource. So whenever I talk to people in the media or whenever I talk to policymakers, they say, oh yeah, but water's special. You know, it really is like talking to Bruce. It's not special. It's a resource. It's relatively scarce. So if we stick to the fundamentals, we'll probably get most of the answers roughly correct. Regrettably, we haven't really done that. So where did it all go wrong? Well, if we look at water in this country, and if you look historically at the allocation and the development of water resources, there's a couple of real, almost cruel ironies embedded in the things that we have done. So in this state in particular, we have certain influential people like Deakin, who, you know, they're very, I don't know, some of you no doubt are great readers of history. There's all sorts of interpretation of whether the man was completely a nutter. But in any case, the evidence that is left behind is not particularly complimentary in my view. So, driven by the ambitions of particular people, it seems that we said, well, you know, water really is very scarce in this country. In fact, if you asked politicians in this country, invariably they say, oh, this is the driest continent on earth. And it's not quite true, not quite true. In actual fact, Australia has more water per head of population than Switzerland, more water per head of population than Spain and France. The problem, of course, is that water in this country is highly variable, both in a spatial sense and in a temporal sense. So we go through periods when we have very little water, as people in Bendigo no doubt realise. We also go periods of great plenty, and of course its geographical distribution is quite variable. So we have various people who will tell us that, well, all we need is a big pipe that's built by the engineers of Bendigo. Just run that water downhill, because most people, I think about 8 out of 10 people in Australia actually believe that water naturally flows north-south, because that's the top of the map. That's the top of the map, and it must flow to the bottom of the map. You know, not much of an understanding of hydrology or geography. Anyway, so putting aside the great schemes of pipes running everywhere, it's kind of interesting that because people were fearful of scarcity, we went about building giant structures to harness this variable resource. And the tag that was often used, which I know many of you will be familiar with now, is things like nation building. Now, words are really important. Words are really important. So when you're an economist, and if you've been working in water for about 10 or 15 years, there's a few words to look out for. One of them is nation building. It usually means benefits fall short of cost, but we're going to do it anyway. The other one is iconic. Iconic usually means we haven't even looked at the benefits and costs, but we're going to do it anyway. The other one, my colleagues in the irrigation sector usually argue for this thing called a level playing field. And I keep saying I can't quite work out what that is. It's a bit like we have things in water pricing. We have lower bound and upper bound pricing. You know, you won't find that in an economics text anywhere. But those in irrigation are usually on the lower bound. But anyway, I'll come back to that later. Okay, so having been led to believe that this scarcity is a critical problem, we then set about building massive structures. And this basically went on for the best part of 100 years. We went around building massive structures. And not only did we build massive structures, oddly enough, this is the kind of funny thing. We built these massive structures and then we pretended that water wasn't scarce anymore. Then we started handing it out. So we were exceedingly generous with the allocations that we then handed out to people. In fact, I can even remember many years ago, before I was in academia, I owned an orchard at a place called Menindee, and part of the requirement of my entitlement was to make sure that I used it all. Because the New South Wales government had a very strong view at that time that anything that left the state was a waste. Just as many people now argue that water running to sea is a waste. In fact, the Tasmanian government, right this very minute, is arguing that it needs to be the new food bowl. And it's advocating that all that water that runs west in Tasmania is running to waste. So all they need to do is turn it inland to some salty soils and then all will be fixed. So this attitude, this kind of philosophy about water, big engineering works, usually funded by, well, almost always funded by the public purse, primarily because when private irrigators were asked to fund it, they then went broke and then the taxpayer picked up the bill anyway. So most of these were built by public funds, usually with very little analysis on either the economic or agronomic front, and usually they were built for other reasons. They were often built around ideas of soldier settlement, built around the idea of having a noble yeomanry out there in the paddock being very compliant and doing the sorts of things we wanted them to. So it wasn't really until about the 1960s, even though economists were even arguing with Deakin early on, saying, well, we don't really think you should be doing this in northern Victoria, it wasn't really until about the 1960s that we started to see the tide starting to turn. And a fellow called Bruce Davidson wrote a very influential book called Australia Wet or Dry. And Bruce just poignantly pointed out to people that in order to have a successful irrigation sector, you needed two things. You needed reliable and lots of water, and the second thing you needed was lots of labour, because in actual fact, irrigation is a labour-intensive industry. Because the difficulty was Australia had neither. What we did have was lots of arable land, which meant we had and retain a comparative advantage in dryland agriculture, but do not have, and will never have, as far as I'm concerned, a comparative advantage in irrigated agriculture. So things started to turn a little bit in the 1960s, and governments were pushed to try and produce reports to show that these things were worth doing. So it became a little bit more difficult for engineers to build their big structures and get away with it. And it wasn't until about the first COAG reforms of 1994 that we really started to get serious about water policy in this country. So the major reforms of 1994 did certain things, like insisting that people actually pay for water, insisting that there be water rights which could be traded so a market could allocate it to its best use, and various other reforms which I'll talk about now. There were some good things to come out of that period. One of the remarkable achievements, in my view, was the agreement on the Murray-Darling Basin cap. So we managed to get jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, who for years have been rivals over water, to agree that it did not make any sense to continue handing out more entitlements to water. This graph shows you the growth in annual diversions. Quite clearly that's a non-trivial growth in diversions, and what was really happening, the impetus for this was the realisation that many people who had entitlements were now suddenly discovering there was no water. So it wasn't necessarily a great concern about the ecology of the system. It was more a concern with the fact that once you've handed out all these rights, if people are drawing it out upstream, there's none coming out the end of the pipe. And so there was a realisation that this was just not really a sustainable policy approach. Now, the reason I would argue that this is a major achievement is because it's very difficult to achieve this elsewhere. I do some work in India, and trying to get states to agree about allocation of water is a serious problem, and is usually handled by a higher court who simply has to make rulings about those things. So having achieved a cap is a non-trivial achievement. The other good things were people were persuaded that markets do a pretty good job of allocating resources, so we began to establish real water markets. So what we have on the screen here is one of those exchanges, Watermove, which operates up in the Goulburn Valley, and water is traded on a temporary basis and on a permanent basis. So I'll just quickly touch on those things so that you understand what I'm talking about. In the water lexicon in Australia, we use temporary trades and permanent trades. Now, a temporary trade is a trade of an annual allocation. So if you like, it's the water that's in the jar. The water's in the jar. It actually has water in it. Temporary trade means you're trading real water. Permanent trade is the glass. Permanent trade is the glass, which means you have bought a glass, and if there's water, it might fill up. So there's a difference between those two. One is an entitlement to draw water, so that's permanent trade, and the other is temporary trade, which is actual water that's available this season. And the temporary market is by far the most vibrant and active in most water markets. But we managed to do this by separating water and allowing people to trade. Another remarkable achievement in this phase between about 1994 and 2004 was we did get governments to sign up and agree that we would not spend any more public money subsidising things that were dumb. We would not use any more public money that did not pass economic and ecological muster. So we had agreement that there would be no more subsidies for irrigation, basically. There would be no more subsidies for pipes, dams, infrastructure. Even if you came to the table with it dressed up as a thing called renovation or modernisation or some other thing, there was an agreement that there was to be no more use of public funds if it didn't make any sense. Right. If we can turn now then to the current phase, and you might note that I'm now starting to get a little depressed. I guess since about 2004, 2005, things have somewhat changed. And part of the reason it has changed is because this issue of over-allocation has proven quite vexatious and difficult for people to deal with.